Okay, I think we're live.
Yes, we are. Boa noite para todo mundo, né? Agradecer a todos os presentes e a todas as presentes. Estou aqui com o meu queridíssimo Luiz, né? Já gostaria de agradecer de antemão por você ter auxiliado aí em put together, né? Em organizar essa mesa. Então, obrigada por você estar aí com a gente. O programa de pós-graduação lhe agradece imensamente.
Eu que agradeço a oportunidade de estar aqui colaborando com vocês e o que promete ser uma ótima mesa depois dessa entrada triunfal.
Triunfal, né, gente? Eu gostei da musiquinha. Então, a mesa de hoje a gente tem convidados bem especiais, né? A gente vai tentar moderar aí de uma forma que seja acessível para todo mundo, ainda que tenha a barreira da língua inglesa, né? Mas eu e o Luiz estamos aí para fazer toda a transição, Luiz principalmente, que é o que está com o inglês mais updated. O meu está totalmente off. Mas, enfim.
E lembrando que muita gente compreende inglês, mas às vezes não se sente confortável fazendo a pergunta em inglês, coisas assim, então vocês podem sempre deixar a pergunta ou comentário em português, que a gente faz a tradução na hora de perguntar para a Lauryn, que só entende inglês, e no caso do Santiago, eu acho que o português dele já é ótimo.
Sim, embora o Santiago, né, vai apresentar em inglês para poder ter o debate com a Lauryn, essa é a ideia, né, da mesa, uma mesa redonda. Ele sabe português também, então quem quiser sinta-se livre para fazer as perguntas em português. Eu faço, então, agora a questão mais formal, né?
Como que a gente está de público, porém? Talvez a gente possa esperar mais
Vamos olhar, temos 17. Ele tem escrito ali uns 17 online.
Vamos deixar ela mais... Deixar ela 7.5 exatamente.
Tá, então vamos deixar 7.5. Então vamos fazendo os agradecimentos, né? A Lauryn e ao Santiago, o agradecimento público. We, Louise and I, in the name of the program in history at the University of Pelotas, would like to thank you so much for this night, for this discussion table. We are so happy to have you here, and it will be a great night. I hope so.
Yeah, and we would like to thank you for taking time of your day and having to work this out in different time zones, because I do believe we're working with 3 different time zones here, so...
No, Santiago's times is like us.
Oh, yeah? Oh, okay,
yes.
So 2 time zones. Still quite the effort, and so thank you very, very much for that.
Should we start it?
Yeah, I think we can. I think we can start. There's another intro and things will pick up from there, I believe.
So this discussion table is about identity and integration in Atlantic Europe. And we have here Lauryn and Santiago Barreiro. And that's it. Let's start it.
All right. Hi, Lauryn.
Hello. So I have pulled up my screen to share it. You pull it up?
Yeah.
Marcelo, por favor.
Let me see if it's not. I thought I still had it shared. Just a second.
Yeah, maybe it ended. No worries. We're not in a hurry.
There we go. Okay. Okay. So, Ted, first of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity. And I will go ahead and start. Francis Dolan, first of all, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? Ah, thank you. Yes, you can. Okay. Francis Dolan, noting early modern male fascination with and fear of violent women, children, and servants, ascribed it to their status as dangerous familiars, beings under subjection whose very proximity to their rulers, husbands, parents, masters, gave them opportunity for violence and revolt. Despite the fact that those subjected suffered exponentially more violence than inflicted it, early modern pamphlets occluded their existence as victims and trumpeted incidents of underling violence as a way to justify continued oppression. In describing these acts of violence on the part of the subjective, pamphlet writers rendered the authors of the violence as monstrous and unnatural, rather than portray their acts as an inherent potential in domestic imbalances of power. In an early modern ideological framework heavily dependent on analogical structures, commonwealth as body, land as virgin, this concept lent itself well to the collaborative work of building Ireland, a construction that was designed as much to justify its conquest as it was to provide a safe repository for home front anxieties, relying on both the practices of projection and displacement as well as the traditional colonialist tactic of describing victims of colonization as either monsters to be destroyed or pitiable savages to be civilized. As Patrick O'Farrell notes, any ethics of conquest posits the inferiority of those to be subjugated, ethical inferiority, not merely inferiority in strength. The need for this construction was urgent. The complete conquest of Ireland was seen as necessary to neutralize the threat of its alliance with Spain, Italy, or France, quell internal revolts against English rule, and thus allow England to exploit its rich resources. More troubling to the Tudor court was the way in which Irish revolt brought to the forefront the unstable political foundation of the Gilded Palace. Irish anger at the imposition of Anglicanism had the potential to strike a chord with English Catholics, unwilling converts, and Protestants. English appropriation of Irish land and offices echoed too closely the recent dissolution of the monasteries, the seizing of assets, a tactic that even Henry's supporters viewed with anxiety as a dangerous precedent, and the installment of the feared new men into positions of power normally reserved for the great landed aristocracy. Finally, the frequent revolts led by powerful Irish aristocrats disturbed a dynasty already haunted by Henry IV's usurpation of the throne and the War of the Roses, and troubled by revolts both in Wales and much closer to home. To counter this inherent instability, the Tudor court carried out another form of colonizing, using the medieval past as an ideological resource. Court officials, artists and artisans, scribes and scholars mined historical chronicles and early records in an attempt to create a trans-historical, providential dynasty and nascent empire. The Society of Antiquaries' primary purpose was to explore early historical documents to justify present practices or locate the origins thereof. And one of the richest veins for these antiquaries was the Polychronicon, first composed by Ranulph Higden around 1350 and then translated into English by John Trevisa in 1383. A massive work, both in scope and finished form, it attempted to relate the entire history and geography of the known world from creation until the reign of Edward II. Trevisa later updated it, ending with the reign of Edward III, and it remained an authoritative and popular text well into the 18th century. There are 22 known extant manuscripts of Higden's Latin Chronicle and 14 known remaining of Trevisa's translation. 13 other writers created further continuations, and it easily surpassed the Brute Chronicle in authority and popularity. William Caxton, the early creator of an English canon, chose it as the first chronicle he printed. His followers, Wynkyn de Worde, Richard Pinson, and others, created reprint after reprint of the manuscripts, ensuring that its popularity and authority remained unchallenged. Holinshed, in fact, borrowed heavily from the Polychronicon. The Polychronicon, in turn, relied for its information on Ireland on Gerald of Wales, a member of one of the powerful Norman families involved in the 12th century conquest of Ireland. This first attempt at conquest came around when Dermot McMurrough came to Henry for help against the newly crowned Rory O'Connor. Henry sent Strongbow, the Earl of Pembroke, and his Cambro-Norman followers, who reconquered Leicester. Then Strongbow married McMurrough's daughter and subsequently became King of Leinster himself. In attempting to then subdue Strongbow, Henry was inevitably declaring war on the Irish, since intertwined loyalties and fear of foreign invasion would inevitably bring other chieftains to support Strongbow. Moreover, Henry now faced a formidable Norman-Irish force that combined Norman military technology and resources with Irish support, infrastructure, and military intelligence. Fears of this kind of hybridization informed much of later colonial law, seen particularly in the 1366 Statutes of Kilkenny, which we'll talk about later. Gerald's first visit to Ireland was in 1183, where he helped his brother and uncle by his counsel and diligently explored the site and nature of the island and primitive origin of its race. He returned again in 1185 as part of the great invasion force led by Henry II's son John, again as a counselor to the prince about the Irish land and people. This needs to be stressed, since Gerald's chronicle must be understood as that of a would-be conqueror and defender of Henry II's policies. The history and topography of Ireland was a geographic and temporal map. As Tongchai Winnakuchel notes in the Geobody of Siam, colonialist creation of maps provide a model for, rather than a model of, a particular territory. And this particular territory was framed as an analog to the monstrous, in both senses of the word, lands of the East. Quote, just as the countries of the East are remarkable and distinguished for certain prodigies peculiar and native to themselves, so the boundaries of the West are made remarkable by their own wonders of nature. For sometimes tired, as it were, of the true and serious, nature draws aside and goes away, and in these remote parts indulges herself in these secret and distant freaks. These remote parts were, in fact, only a short day's sailing, as Gerald himself later admits, but he needs to paint an Ireland distant both geographically and culturally in order to create a buffer between the two disturbingly similar lands. The fiction of this geographical remoteness allows him to paint the Irish as secret and distant freaks of a double nature. As you can see in this slide, Ireland and the Irish are linked in a particularly horror-producing aspect of monstrosity, category confusion. On the left, a bearded woman blurs gender boundaries. On the right, the categories of human and animal are blended in the Oxman. In the next slide, let me see. Okay, I'm having a hard, let me see if I can get to that one. No, it's not letting me do this on here. Okay. Okay. All right, let me try sharing this. This is going to get a bit awkward if I have to keep sharing the screen each time for a different slide. Okay. Okay. In the next slide, on the right, barnacle geese are growing on plants, further eroding the distinction between the plant and animal kingdom. Having created a realm that is conceptually far distant from England, Gerald's next move is to show the consequences of living in such a naturally monstrous and uncivilized world. Quote, all of their habits are the habits of barbarians. Since conventions are formed from living together in society, and since they are so far removed in these distant parts from the ordinary world of men, as if they were in another world altogether and consequently cut off from well-behaved and law-abiding people, they know only of the barbarous habits in which they were born and brought up and embrace them as another nature. In the next slide, one of these barbarous practices is illustrated. A kingship ritual in which a white mare is sacrificed and a stew is prepared in which the king bathes and those around him eat, another blurring of two separate cultural habits. Gerald here makes use of the concept of habitus to blur the border between nature and culture. Babies, for example, do not have cleanliness as a part of their essential nature, but years of indoctrination will render this a habit, so much so that as an adult, they will recoil in disgust from stepping in dog poop, a reflex action that could easily be seen as natural. Habitus allows the Irish to be human, but humans whose social practices have degraded them to a level of barbarous and bestial nature, justifying harsh treatment and a complete uprooting of their culture in order, like the wild land, to become cultivated. The use of habitus as another nature within Gerald's text actually serves to destabilize the idea of an alien Irish, as Gerald notes his fear of contagion of the English by the Irish, something that should not be possible since the English supposedly have long been practicing the proper habits. Quote, to such an extent does one seem to be here allowed to carry out whatever one desires. People are so concerned not with what is honorable, but all of them only with what is expedient. So strongly has the pest of treachery grown and put in roots here, so natural through long usage have bad habits become, that foreigners coming to this country almost inevitably are contaminated by this, as it were, inborn vice of the country, a vice that is most contagious. At the same time, he needs to be able to show this territory as having near and familiar potential to become another England under proper English authority and industry. After a tirade about the laziness and barbarity of the Irish, he adds, quote, the wealth of the soil is lost, not through the fault of the soil, but because there are no farmers to cultivate even the best land. The fields demand, but there are no hands. It seems the soil is crying out for English rescue. The Irish are too lazy to plant the foreign types of trees that would do very well here. This other nature is a continual source of anxiety to Gerald, who attempts to lay the blame for it variously on geographic isolation, barbaric customs, internal strife, and the lack of pastoral care by an Irish clergy more contemplative than conscientious. All of these anxieties come to play in one of the longest anecdotes he provides about the wonders of Ireland. A priest on an overnight journey is accosted by a wolf, who tells him not to fear and relates the following tale. Because of St. Natalis' curse, every 7 years, one man and one woman from Ossory are compelled to go in exile from their human form and take the shape of wolves, returning after their 7 years are up. This wolf's female companion was dying and sent him to find a priest to give her the last rites and sacrament. The priest, full of fear, follows the wolf to find a dying she-wolf. He gives her the last rites, but hesitates to give her the sacrament, falsely saying he doesn't have him with him. The male wolf brings the priest's bundle with the sacrament, and to convince the priest to give it to her, quote, He pulled the skin off the she-wolf from the head down to the navel, folding it back with his paw as if it were a hand. And immediately the shape of an old woman, clear to be seen, appeared. At that, the priest, more through terror than reason, communicated her, and she then devoutly received the sacrament. Afterwards, the skin which had been removed by the he-wolf resumed its proper position. Gerald takes up a great deal of time recounting this tale, and in the final paragraph seems very anxious that he is authorized to recount it, noting that 2 years later he is called to a synod in Meath, seemingly convened to discuss the matter following the priest's confession. There's almost an overkill of authorities here. The bishop calls the synod, also summoning the neighboring bishops and abbots, and demands that Gerald come, if at all possible, or at least to give his advice in writing. Gerald does so, and the bishop and synod agreed with it and sent the priest to the pope with the documents, in which were given an account of the affair in the priest's confession, and which were sealed with the seal of the bishops and abbots then present. However, nowhere in this paragraph is Gerald's advice directly revealed. More important, it seems, that this story of skin changing be covered by another authoritative skin, the vellum of the official document. What we see here is not the recounting of an authority, but the creation of an authoritative picture of the Irish as border crossers between human and animal. Ossory was a major power center in medieval Irish politics, fragmenting under the Norman conquest under Strongbow into the Anglo-Norman territory comprising County Kilkenny and the Upper Third, Upper Ossory, whose hereditary lordship remained dangerously independent until the reconquest under Henry VIII. The idea of shapeshifting resonated with a power elite worrying about Norman-Irish intermingling, a practice that spread to the later English colonizers as well. It only takes a quick skim through the 1366 statutes of Kilkenny, imposed by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, to see the fear of this kind of skin changing. The prologue of the statute sets this fear out very plainly. The English are changing skins and taking on Irish identities. Whereas at the conquest, quote, whereas at the conquest of the land of Ireland, the English of the said land used the English language, mode of riding, and apparel, but now many English of the same land, forsaking the English language, manners, mode of riding, laws, and usages, live and govern themselves according to the manners, fashion, and language of the Irish enemies, and also have made diverse marriages and alliances between themselves and the Irish enemies aforesaid, whereby the said land and the liege people are of, the English language, the allegiance due to our Lord the King, and the English laws there are put in subjection and decayed, and the Irish enemies exalted and raised up contrary to reason. In response, Article 3 of the statute sets out the way for the English to change their skins back. It is ordained and established that every Englishman do use the English language and be named by an English name, leaving off entirely the manner of naming used by the Irish, and that every Englishman use the English custom, fashion, mode of riding, and apparel according to his estate, and if any English or Irish living among the English use the Irish language among themselves, contrary to the ordinance, and of thereof be attainted, his lands and tenements, if he have any, shall be seized into the hands of his immediate lord, until he come to the places of our Lord the King and find sufficient surety to adopt and use the English language. Despite the severity of the penalties for cultural skin changing, seizure of property, imprisonment, fines, the statutes were largely ignored. A new method of keeping the borders secure had to be found, and this time the new power of the printing press was harnessed to build a narrative wall between the civilized English and the wild Irish. In 1480, when a flood of print poured out of the presses, the public could read or listen to a tale of an astounding land where unnatural sexuality ran rampant, where innocent-looking rabbits were witches in disguise, monstrous births seemingly happened daily, and gender roles were turned upside down, a place at the end of the world. The text was the first printed edition of Teresa's Polychronicon, edited and printed by England's first printer, editor, translator, and publisher, William Caxton. As England's first printer, Caxton was in a unique position to reauthorize and disseminate texts on a massive scale. Caxton excised Teresa's early geography and ethnography and began with a teleological history that culminated in the England of Edward III. Following that, he selected the earlier geoethnographic descriptions of England, Ireland, and Wales and appended them in a description of England, an editorial move that both validated the importance of England in the earlier history and enacted on the page the kind of territorial subjugation to the English crown that was far more tenuous in political reality. And the description of Ireland came last, placing it materially as the remotest land. Most of the text is Gerald. However, Caxton adds his own additions of witches turning into animals, and where, in this land, horror of horrors, quote, the men piss sitting down and the women standing. While Gerald and Caxton, making use of Gerald, move uneasily between natura and habitus in their discussion of the Irish, later Tudor texts were written in a period when the English plantations were in constant peril, with unrest culminating in the Fitzgerald Revolt of 1579 that in turn triggered a series of explosive revolts across English-held Ireland. Gerald's grandiose prediction, by this history I shall instruct posterity, was fulfilled as Tudor England found itself again faced with the problem of Ireland. The situation as they saw it was dire, and pamphleteers turned to Gerald and Caxton's excised history and description of Ireland to create the pictures of the Irish that would justify more severe measures. Thus, writers like Sidney, Spencer, Derrick, Hooker, and a host of others focused primarily on natura as something that needed strict control, punishment, and possibly complete annihilation. Sidney states that with the Irish, quote, no passion will prevail but fear, besides their story which plainly paints it out, using past history, their manner of life wherein they choose rather all filthiness than any law or their own consciousness who know best their own natures, gives sufficient proof of. For little is lenity to prevail in minds so possessed with a natural inconstancy. Spencer, while rejecting Gerald's popish fables, in his view on the present state of Ireland, takes his cue from Gerald's idea of inherent monstrosity and barbarity as an argument for their, in his view, ignorant and intractable rebellion against the imposition of English law. It is a nation ever acquainted with wars, though but amongst themselves and in their own kind of military discipline trained up from their youths, which they have never yet been taught to lay aside, nor made to learn obedience unto the law, scarcely to know the name of law, but instead thereof have always preserved and kept their own law, which is the Brehon law. Note here that English law is generalized and naturalized to the abstract law. Because of this refusal to bend to English law, Spencer advocates extremely severe measures, including wiping out certain populations to save Ireland and its resources from itself. You can see the same move done in Book 5 of Spencer's Fairy Queen, where Irena, a personification of the land of Ireland, is disinherited and menaced with death by the giant tyrant Gran Torto, symbolizing both the threat of Irish possible alliance with Spain and Irish rebellions. The loutish, uncivilized, and violent giant, as Geraldine Hang and others have pointed out, is a typical characterization of, quote, undeserving native populations that resist colonial violence. In desperation, Irena the Land begs for help from Gloriana, Queen Elizabeth, who sends Artegall, a figure representing justice, to go and fight the giant and free Irena. Irena is set back on her throne with Artegall by her side, who stays and has a daily agenda, quote, to search out those that used to rob and steal, or did rebel against lawful government, on whom he did inflict most grievous punishment. In Spencer's case, criminal activity and rebellion are conflated. To rebel is to engage in criminal activity. Edward Campion's A History of Ireland borrows and highlights Gerald's tales of blood-drinking bestiality and incest, and Caxton's description of the evil magic practiced by the Irish and ties them to Irish aggression in speaking of a particular ritual, whereby the Irish leave the right arm of their male children unbaptized so that it may strike a more ungracious and deadly blow. John Derrick's The Image of Ireland, and here's the next slide, okay, tracks a kind of rake's progress where the wild Irish kerns first attack, rob, and kill the English and their own countrymen, engage in a monstrous carnivalesque feast, and are finally routed by Sidney's forces in an attempt to show the English population that first, the Irish deserve to be colonized, and second, that English law and force will prevail. The frontispiece here captures the narrative moves to be made within, and I quote, the image of Ireland, with the discovery of woodcarn, in other words, the Irish kerns, wherein is most lively expressed the nature and quality of the said wild Irish woodcarn, their notable aptness, celerity, and proneness to rebellion, and by way of argument is manifested their original and offspring, their nascent and pedigree. Also their habit and apparel is plainly shown. the execrable life and miserable death of Rory Raug, that infamous arch-traitor to God and the crown, is likewise described. Lastly, the coming in of the great O'Neill of Ireland with the effect of his submission to the Right Honourable Sir Sidney. The Kern or Carn, originally simply meaning a light infantryman in the Middle Ages, is here seen as wild, savage, and biologically prone to rebellion, proven by generations of rebels. In the next slide, okay, rebellion is shown as merciless predation, and you can't see you can't see here the sort of verse underneath it, but I will subject you to it, even though it's truly appalling poetry because it's important. Here creepeth out of St. Filcher's Wealds a pack of prowling mates, most hurtful to the English pale and noisome to the states, which spare no more their country birth than those of the English race. They spoil and burn and bear away as fit occasion serves, and think the greater ill they do, the greater praise deserve. In other words, to have their deeds memorialized in bardic tales. They spare not for the poor man's cry, nor yet respect his tears, but rather joy to free the fire to flash about his ears. And thus bereaving him of goods, of cattle, and of store, they do return back to the woods from whence they came before. Like predatory animals, a pack, prowling, they seized upon the weakest of the group and returned to the woods. The barbarity and anti-Catholicism you see in the picture of Saint Filcher or Saint Thief is echoed in the next illustration of the Victory Feast. And here's the poem. And when into their fenced hold the knaves are entered in, to smite and knock the cattle down, the hangmen do begin. One plucketh off the ox's coat, which he even did now wear. Another lacking pans to boil the flesh, his hide prepare. And friar smell feast sneaking in, doth preach among the best. Both bard and harper is prepared, which by their cunning art do play and cheer up all the guests with comfort at the heart. The slide here shows the barbarity of the feast. The cow is cooked in its own hide because they lack utensils. Note here the way skin or hide is used as a way of designating barbarity or animality, like Gerald's werewolves. With the supposedly corrupt priest and the bard encouraging these kinds of raids with blessings and epic tales. On the right, the association with filth is made as two men, breeches down, appear to be taking a dump on what looks like a round of bread, a metaphor for the general accusations that the Irish were wasting the resources of their land. The next slide here shows the routing of the Irish Kerns by Sidney's army, a promise that Ireland will eventually be subjugated. Right in the middle of the image, if you can see right in there, there's a banner, okay, where reading Piper that draws attention to a fallen bagpiper and his crushed pipes, encapsulating the fantasy that texts such as Derrick's will eventually crush the rebellious bardic music. Finally, a more subtle approach can be seen in the frontispieces to Hooker's Irish History, a translation and expansion of Gerald of Wales' Topographia Hibernia, one that nicely encapsulates most of the points of this talk. As you can see, the title is enclosed within a rather classical Roman frame with two stern-looking men on either side. Within this framework, order prevails. Outside, however, okay, two hunched pan figures with their wild and diabolic connotations play the pipes while other figures lounge within a riot of foliage, a nice reworking of the civilized English Pale and the chaos without. 3 quotes are listed below. The first 2 from Ecclesiastes and Acts, both recount the search through text to the truth. The third in Latin notes the pleasures of finding truth in history. Thus, a top-to-bottom reading of the page sets out a picture of Ireland. The next 2 quotes validate the picture by showing the effort involved in searching through history, and the final quote guarantees the truth value of the text and promises pleasure to the reader. One of the chief Tudor complaints about the Irish were the border raids, where the wild Irish Kerns would invade the Pale and plantations to steal cattle and goods to sustain themselves. In order to justify their larger-scale practice of the same, Tudor writers raided the archives in order to find the texts that fed their own fantasies and fears. Thank you.
Lauryn, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so rich in information.
Thank you.
And we already have question, but we are going to let it to the end. Yes, please.
Yeah, we're going to do the questions after, so you both can answer and, well, discuss. That's the idea, right? So without further ado, I think we should go ahead and pass the word to Professor Santiago.
Santiago?
Yeah. Hi.
This stage is yours.
Thank you. So whenever you want, I can start.
Let's do the video first.
Oh yeah,
okay.
With your presentation,
you really
with
like
your
the thing,
picture.
You know?
Yes.
So go ahead whenever you. So, okay, now after the introduction, I can start. Let me share my screen. Let me see.
The stage is yours, finally.
Yeah, okay. Here we go. Okay. Now you can see that thing. Yeah, that will be great. So before I start, I want to thank Dani, Marcelo, Luis for hosting me in this series of talks and meetings, and also I want to thank Lauryn for sharing this panel with me. And because we are running short of time, I think I will just start right away. I want to ask everybody forgiveness for my English is being a bit rusty. I have not been speaking English for quite a long time, so sorry if this is weird. And my Portuguese will be equally wrong, so I don't think there will be a lot of problems with this. So my talk is about identity and integration in medieval Iceland. It's a bit different from Lauryn's in the sense that I will try to give a kind of broad overview without focusing so much on sources. It will be interesting to have a different stance, and of course the time frame is different. I don't extend into the modern period. I rather stick to the 13th and slightly into the 14th century maybe, but it's very kind of focused time-wise. So I will tackle both problems. I first will begin with the matter of identity. Now you can see the second slide. Okay, this is working. My main question is, how does the fact that Iceland is a new society affect local medieval identity? In this sense, Iceland is a pretty unique place in Europe, because compared to the rest of Europe, it's the only kind of large landmass that gets populated only in the High Middle Ages. Iceland was empty, likely, or at least it had some, at worst or at best, it depends, but it might have had a few hermits from Irish origin, probably. But in practice, the settlement only starts in the late 9th or maybe early 10th century by people from Norway mostly. And this is a problem for Icelanders when they start writing, which is something that happens in the 12th century, because they need to imagine themselves as Icelanders, as a new people, but at the same time, they are clearly an extension of older people, of an earlier people, like Norsemen of some kind. That's a complicated question. I won't go into the Viking Age in any way. So my answer is along the lines of the ideas. Some of this is mine, but most of this is actually taken from the ideas of the main specialist in this matter, which is Dr. Sverrir Jakobsson from the University of Iceland, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on this matter. It's a great book, except it's only in Icelandic, so it's not easy reading. And one of the ideas is, okay, how do Icelanders picture themselves in the world? How do they identify their own existence as a distinct group from, let's say, Norwegians, Danes, Englishmen, or all that kind of peoples which they are in contact with? So I have identified a few elements which constitute integration, and I will try to give a few examples of how this affects different aspects of identity. I consider identity in Iceland is multidimensional. There, of course, you can mention a lot of other aspects or concerns, but this, I think, is the kind of the meat of the matter, the major kind of concerns. The first thing I will mention is ancestry. Then I will move into political affiliation, then move to land ownership, and finally Christianity. So, okay, identity is first focused on ancestry, and I've chosen to comment a source. Most of the time I will give a few examples based on a single source, but I will give a kind of general overview first. My source here will be a short document called Skrá Meðtortólum Sturlunga. It's a complicated name, and it means registry or catalog on the genealogy of the Sturlungar. The Sturlungar are a very prominent family in the early 13th century, the most famous author from medieval Iceland. If you ever read anything on the Norse Icelandic literature world, is most likely you heard that name or you read it. This Snorri Sturluson is one of the main figures, but he's not the only important one. There are many, many important figures in this family. They are the descendants, the Ungar, of a man called Sturla Kvamur. It's a farm in Western Iceland. And they are a prominent lineage. And this document, which is very, very particular, it's written probably in the late 13th century, around 1280 or something like that. And it is most likely written for or by, or both, a man named Egil Sölmundarson, who is in the next generation after Snorri, is his nephew. And it's a list of the ancestors of someone like him and his sister. His name Gyda. I think Gyda is the sister or the aunt, I don't remember. Anyway, and one of the things that is interesting about this genealogy is that it focuses mostly on male ancestors, but sometimes it shifts into female ancestors when the female provides a better link. It's 80% or more males, but sometimes there are women. And this makes sense considering that the kinship system in medieval Iceland was bilateral or bilateral. I don't know how to say that word in English. Bilateral sounds logical for me in Spanish. And there is no need to always mention men, but men are preferred. And this is very, very coherent with what we knew about the real kinship system in the time and in that society. The thing that is more interesting is that when he starts mentioning his whole lineage, he starts with Adam, like right from the beginning of humankind, and he moves into every kind of important figure he can find. It's fun to read this source. It starts with Adam and then moves into a lot of biblical figures mostly from the Old Testament. Then it makes a shift into the classical world, and you start getting mentions of the Greco-Roman gods, and you get Zeus, you get Hercules, you get a lot of people there. And then by some kind of trick, it moves into the Norse gods and heroes. So you get Thor, you get Odin, and you get Sigurd, the killer of the dragon, and so on. You get everyone. Then it starts moving closer in time to his, and then starts mentioning royal figures from the Norse world, like mostly from Norway, and this is an important element. And then it ends with, Icelandic farmers. So it's like, you're like seeing a kind of progression from the most abstract and most powerful and the most important figures into like you know, closer in time, you get to, you know, this farmer who lived in that farm. That's kind of long shot from, you know, Zeus and Odin, but, well, that's the point. It's a very interesting document, but I think it ends with Egil, and Egil was not a very important person, not a kind of minor figure. He was a mid-rank farmer in a very important learning center in Iceland called Reykholt, still there. And I think it's a very interesting document because Egil was trying to show how he was an important man anyway. And he uses ancestry to identify himself not only as an Icelander, but as an Icelander who descends from the most prominent people in his universe. You know, yeah, I'm just an Icelandic farmer, but everyone in my society comes from these kind of important figures, or at least people in my family. And this is an important matter. Icelandic identity has problems with defining family and general identity. On the one hand, you have, you know, this identity focused on your own lineage and your own kind of land, and on the other hand, it's a general identity. I won't go deep into that matter because I don't have the time, but you know, there is this tension between general Icelandic identity and local, personal, familiar identity. That's just you, so you know. A second element that matters is political affiliation, and a good example here is a text I have recently translated into Spanish. It's called Bjarnar Saga Hitalakapa. It's called the Saga of Bjorn, the champion of the Main of Hitardale. That will be translation. Is most likely from the early 13th century. And the main character in this document is a poet. His name Bjorn. And it's also from a mid-rank family that was, I won't say opposed, but they were like dominated by the Sturlungar, who were their neighbors. And here the strategy is to show that Bjorn and people like him were important, not because they were descendant from important people, but they were important because they were in the service of some political figure. In the case of Bjarnar Saga, is the patron saint of Norway nowadays, who was the King Olafur Haraldsson, known as Olafur the Saint. And Bjorn, who is an Icelandic farmer and a poet, moves into the court of the Norwegian king and gets the favor, and he becomes, you know, a favorite of the king. And there is all these kind of adventures and so on. It's a bit courtly for some periods, the saga. It's a weird text, not particularly good. It's, I have to say, I'm saying bad things about the text I translated, but it's not particularly interesting in literary terms. But an important thing here that we will see shows up again in the late part of the talk is the idea that the king gave him a special gift. And this is an important matter. Bjorn is an important man and is an important Icelander because he has a tie with the Norwegian king, and because the Norwegian king shows his friendship through a kind of special gift with a piece of clothing. It doesn't matter much. And another important thing here in terms of identity is the contrast that is rather stark between the life at the Norwegian court, which is a fancy place, and the rather modest life in the Icelandic farm. And this matters a lot for Icelanders. Icelanders will often play on this. So now, a third element is land ownership, and here we shift to another saga, a saga I know very well and is very famous, is Egil Saga Skallagrímssonar, the saga of Egil, the son of Grímur the Bald. That will be the translation. And it's a very important saga, very long. It's most likely or most certainly from the early 13th century, and is most likely composed by someone associated with the Sturlungar. Some people say that by Snorri himself. I won't delve into that matter. And it's a tale of a poet, like Bjarnar Saga, but it's divided in two sections. It's a bit written like a Bible. The first part prefigurates the second part. It's a very interesting text and rather long, and this one is well written. It's fun to read. So, and this is a bit the opposite from what you get in Bjarnar Saga. In Egil Saga, what configurates or creates the main sense of identity is land ownership. The family of Egil, his father Skallagrímur, his uncle, and his brother, both are named Þorolfur. They are important people, and they are essentially Icelanders because they are settlers. What matters here is that they are people who own land and who are against the king. They are not servants of the king. And when someone becomes a servant of the king, it's a risky business. And it usually ends badly. The saga is a bit of I won't say nationalistic, but it shows that serving kings in foreign lands is not a great deal. It can really go wrong. And owning your own land in your own country is the best idea. And this is an important theme in a few Icelandic texts, where being Icelander means owning land in Iceland. And this is an important matter. So finally, because this has to be fast, a last element, which is obvious, is faith. For Icelanders, being Christians was a very, very important matter. And this is something that only happens when they become Christians. And you might say, okay, pagan identity meant nothing. And of course, this is a debated issue, but my answer is pretty simple. No, there was nothing very important about being a pagan, because paganism was not an institutionalized religion. There was nothing like temples, nothing like church, nothing like priests. So actually, paganism was kind of a regional matter. So when they convert, they turn Christian. Being Christian becomes important, and Icelanders solve this in a very interesting way. They consider themselves parts of the Christian world, of course, Latin Christianity, but they consider themselves peripheral. Their worldview is centered, of course, in the main holy centers of Christianity, Rome and Jerusalem, and they will sort this out by negotiating between their own identity as people from the north, and here they will also mention their link with other important Nordic lands, including Christian lands like Trondheim, which was a major peregrination center, centered around the tomb of this king, Olafur Haraldsson, but also as part of a broader Christianity. And this is seen in learning a lot. I chose as an example of how this impacts Icelandic identity a text which is very weird. It's called Ormar, about snakes. That will be the translation, which is a translation of Isidore of Etymologies, a section called the Serpentibus. And here what Icelanders did is they will translate and incorporate Latin learning, Christian learning in their own culture, but they will do it mostly, not exclusively, but mostly by using their own language, Old Norse or Old Icelandic, as you prefer, and also by altering the text, incorporating local tradition. It's very interesting to compare the Latin original and the translation, because the translation includes a lot of things from the original, but it also adds Norse stuff. Okay, yeah, and here we know this. And there is a kind of hybrid, but what is important here is that they will consider themselves, it shows that they consider themselves part of this Latin learned Christian world. So this is kind of a very short, quick overview of how identity played on different elements for Icelanders, or at least for learned or people in, when you talk about the Middle Ages and you say, how was identity, how was whatever, most often you talk about the kind of top layer of society. You don't really know how, a poor housecarl thought about himself, but that's what we have. So now a different aspect, and I will shift the focus now into integration. How do Icelanders, not only consider themselves Icelanders, but how do they work as a unit, as a team? And here we have two main problems. The first one is two factors that run against integration. The first one is, I'm going to run into Marxist mode now and talk about economics. I feel really comfortable with this. And this is the matter that production units in Iceland are not particularly helpful for creating an integrated society. Why? Because almost all the production in Iceland was done in very, very similar units. It was a society of isolated farms. They all, or most of them, produced exactly the same goods, the same matters. So there was no incentive, no promotion of integration by economic needs. Each farm could survive essentially on its own in terms of pure production. Of course, this did not happen because of the reasons we will see in a few minutes. But the production system is very atomistic, we will say, if that's a word in English. And this is, I'm going to run into Durkheimian classical sociology mode. It's a society of mechanical solidarity. All production units are similar. Therefore, there is no reason for them to integrate, because each one could live on its own. Another aspect that runs counter the need to integrate is the landscape. Iceland is a very hostile land. It's not very friendly for humans. Large parts of the territory are impossible to live in. It's, rather cold, obviously, but it's also full of volcanoes. It has earthquakes. It's not the kind of place you want to live. It's not like you're in southern Brazil, which is a good place to live, in terms of landscape at least. It's a very difficult land, and this creates a very fragmented society. Traveling across the land is not simple. Of course, wintertime is horrible. And this creates a society where isolation is a very, very common phenomenon. Okay, so how do these guys sort this out? Which factors favor integration? First is the law. And this is a very, very important thing that appears in Icelandic sources, is the idea that what creates Icelandic integration, what makes all the Icelanders belong in the same bag, is law, a common law. And there is a famous saying in Iceland, is "Med lögum skal land byggja," which means with the law, the country, or the land, it's the same, shall be built. The idea that Icelanders are a unity, they are integrated in a same group because they share a common law. This is very common in the Middle Ages, of course, this is nothing special. But what is weird in Iceland is that they can do this without a king. And this is something that other sources that talk about Icelanders often mention. Oh, Icelanders are strange because they don't have a king, but they have that law of their own. And a system of assemblies and so on. I won't delve into the details. Another element that, of course, helps to integrate them as a unified group is religion. Religion, of course, the conversion is formally near the year 1000. Some people say 999, others say it's 1000. It's irrelevant. But what matters is that this actually, in practice, only happens after there is an institutionalized church, and this is mostly from the early 12th century. It's very late in European terms. And finally, if production, now I'm back into economics, if production if production hinders the development of integration, exchange does the opposite. Matters of exchange are very important for integration in this society. In particular, institutions like gift giving and feasting. There is an excellent book on this by an Icelandic scholar named Viðar Pálsson, and he explains how gift giving and feasting works. And this creates an extension of political ties in the form of friendship not in the modern sense, but friendship as political alliance. Vinauta is the Icelandic word. And of course, this also relies on a very basic form of ties which lead to social integration, which are kinship ties. Kinship ties, of course, in most society are a source of integration, and Iceland is not exceptional in this sense. But friendship plays a very, very, very important role, and friendship is in many ways enacted through acts of exchange. People invite each other to drink and to feast together, and they give each other gifts. Something we still do, If we are South Americans, something we like to do is invite each other for food and drinking, and we become friends by doing that. And anyway, now finally, and to close this kind of quick overview on these matters, there are some factors, two of them I have seen, there are probably quite a lot more, that work at the same time for integration and against integration. I will explain this to close this kind of talk. First is the feud culture. Iceland is a very well-known example. Iceland is a very well-known example of a feuding society where blood feuds and personal revenge are a very important matter. Most sagas, if you read them, are about this. And this creates a problem. It, of course, makes centralized authority difficult to achieve, in the sense that feuding societies tend to resist central intervention. This has been very recently discussed in detail in a new book I'm reading right now by Orem Falk, professor at Cornell University. I'm not sure I'm completely in agreement with him, but the point is very important. Feuding culture creates conditions where a centralized political authority becomes difficult, and this, of course, runs against integration, making the rise of kings complicated. And on the other hand, it provides a common cultural framework. Everybody knows that if there are problems in society, we can sort them out through feud, sort them out by compensation, by blood revenge, by the institutions of feud. And this is an important matter because that common cultural code is a form of integration. It makes society work in a very different way from our modern society, but it works. And this is a kind of classical topic in anthropology. So, of course, this changes with time. Iceland becomes a kind of tributary land of Norway. So in the long run, there is a king, and the king provides a form of political integration anyway. Another aspect that is kind of ambiguous is the relationship between wealthy landowners and usually poorer peasants, people with smaller farms, no farms, tenants, freedmen, that kind of folk. And here we see a kind of evolution too. The first is that there is a hierarchy and conflicts, of course, but they can also be very friendly. There is a kind of relationship that resembles kind of a this balanced friendship. You know, the landlords are not only exploiters, but they are also good friends of their own peasants, and they help them, they defend them, but they also take money from them and resources and so on. And here there is a very interesting contrast between two sources. There is Ale Saga, which I mentioned already, where Skatlarimur, the father of Ale, is very friendly with his the people who work at his farms, his house girls. And then we have a also friendly relationship, but now in a more distinct terms of distance between the landowner and the tenants in Hensathori Saga. And here the sagas are probably written in two different time periods, one in the early 13th century, as I already mentioned, and Hensathori Saga is from the late 13th century, both from the same region. And in this, what we see is the ambiguity. Yeah, relationships between the higher layer of society and the lower layer are friendly, but they have changed. In the first time, they all lived together in the same long house in the same farm, while in the later period, now the space has changed. The main farm and the dependent farms are different. We are approaching a model closer to what we see in many other places in Western Europe. In any way, a weird thing about my talk, and with this I want to finish, is that there is no logical conclusion to this. This is a kind of overview, so the last thing I can do is thank everyone for listening to this, and I hope we are still on time. Thank you.
Santiago, thank you so much. We had a spectrum of identity yeah. And alterity, identity and Christianity, identity and integration, identity and monstrosity.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
We do have a question in chat already, but I think it will be more interesting if you have questions for each other first. So you can talk a bit. Yeah. Well, all of us.
I do have one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there is Lucas' question if you want. First, he jumped into the conversation. I see that's usual.
Okay.
Okay. Hang on just a second. I'm seeing.
There is a second part of this question.
Yeah, it's a two-parter.
Okay. Can I see the second part? Oh, interesting. Not directly, right? Not directly. I'm not seeing it in the pamphlets directly, but I think the part of it is if you think about sort of English triumphalist ideas about their own virtue as leading to salvation, right? Then the monstrousness of Irish rebellions then is in that particular framework, I think it's very easy to see that, you know, in an eschatological framework as basically something that's going to lead to their damnation. Okay. And in some of the other pamphlets, actually, the idea of sort of Ireland must be saved and the Irish must be civilized and saved, or they're going to be damned, comes out fairly clearly as well. So yeah, I think absolutely. And you've got an interesting link there, and that's something I'd be really interested in taking a further look at and looking at. Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay.
I do have a, oh, okay. Okay, Lucas writes again. Okay. How does it follow? Yeah. Oh, that's a very short answer. Yes. Yeah, Ari is clearly, for those that know that do not know what Lucas is asking about, Ari Froley was one of the earliest authors in medieval Iceland. He wrote around 1125 or something like that, 1130. He wrote a book called The Book of the Icelanders, Íslendingabók. And he essentially wrote the book to say how Icelanders were so nice because they became Christian. And that unified them and made them a peaceful land. So the answer is pretty... I'm not specialist in Ari, so maybe some specialists will say, no, you are missing this part. But the consensus is that, yes, Ari is trying to show unity through Christian, to becoming Christian. Yeah, that's a very, very plain answer. And can I now follow on a question for Lauryn?
Yeah.
Oh, of course, yes.
So thanks for this fantastic presentation, Lauryn. That was very, very, very nice to hear. And I do not know a lot to say. I barely know anything about Ireland, but do you have sources showing how Irish people answered to this kind of representation by people across the channel? Like, do you have Irish sources talking about how the Irish represent themselves at around time?
Well, one of the things actually that was not sort of the first purview, but one of the things that I'm doing for the larger project is going to be examining Irish pamphlets that are arguing for Irish sovereignty, right, and Irish nationalism. And one of the things that they do is they turn, you know, at least from my sort of, you know, early purview of this, is they turn the tables on this idea of monstrosity and painting the English as these monstrous tyrants that are coming over and trying to oppress them, right? So in a lot of cases, right, the discourse of sort of, you know, alterity and that sort of thing are being sort of used, at least in my preliminary thing, by the Irish of saying that, you know, they are the ones that are being the victim of these monsters, right? These predatory monsters in here. The other interesting thing that happens is they're also picking up on the early medieval texts that talk about the purity of the land, right? Even people like Gerald of Wales and various other people, and Ranulph Higden, the Polychronicon, talk about the fact that there are no venomous serpents in Ireland because the land is so pure that it drives them out, right? Which then turned into the legend of St. Patrick. Or that there are so many fewer diseases in Ireland because the land is so pure and the water is so pure, right? And that discourse of purity then is used, at least in my preliminary things, by some of the Irish pamphleteers, and also in some of the bardic poems about this rebellion, right? As saying, we are already better, right? We are already a product of this pure land, and we do not need these foreign interlopers, right, coming in and contaminating us. So it's interesting that they're turning that sort of rhetoric of contamination back on them. Again, I can't really, this has been something that I've sort of like dipped my toes in. So I'm not really going to be great at answering this question, but at least from my preliminary things, this is what seems to be happening, is that there's a battle over the tropes, right, of contamination, monstrosity, and purity that's going on.
Sweet, thank you.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I just want to point something out, and this is a complete tangent. So, but there's an interesting thing that's going on right now that is analogous to this, which is during, at least in the United States and that sort of thing, there is a discourse about purity and cleanliness in the pandemic, right? Which is interesting because in the early parts, people were calling the people who were not masking, right, plague rats, right? You know, sources of contagion. And now, interestingly enough, recently a particular trend on TikTok among the anti-vaccine population, because they consider the vaccine to be contaminating their blood, is to call themselves purebloods after Harry Potter.
Jesus,
right?
Lord.
With all of its fascistic overtones, right?
Oh,
so it's an
my.
interesting sort of look at, you know, the way in which these sort of tropes get set against each other, and each one of them are using to be weaponized. And maybe I'll write another article on this or something. But though it's a fantastic question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, Santiago, I had a question back at you, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Two actually questions. First off, I was really interested in that idea of royal service being risky in terms of it, with a preference towards insularity and taking care of your own, right? Rather than following into foreign lands, because that's something that you see in sort of art, historical chronicle accounts of Arthur's reign, right? Like Arthur is this great king until he decides to go over and try to conquer the Roman Empire, and he leaves his kingdom behind in the care of Mordred, and that's when everything basically goes to hell in a handbasket, right? So the message is you're supposed to be there and take care of your own rather than trying to go abroad into foreign lands. The other one that I was writing notes down while you were talking, and I was thinking about the idea of maybe integration in another context as well, with that first genealogy that you were talking about, which is absolutely fascinating, and the fact that they're just grabbing from, you know, Greek and classic and biblical. I'm wondering, is that an attempt at maybe some sort of temporal integration, like putting Iceland in connection with the classical world, the world of Norse mythology, the world of the biblical world, and that sort of thing, so that when you get down to these farmers, they're already sort of shimmering with this kind of background?
I will answer them in reverse order, because the second is like a lot easier for me to answer, because it's, yes, of course, that's exactly what they are doing. They are doing like, we belong in the world, and we don't belong in the world as outsiders. We belong as part de la crème of the important people on earth. And they throw everyone in the bag. I think they're using as models genealogies of a similar kind that you have in early England from the Anglo-Saxon period. They are like literally ripping them off, which is something Icelanders are very good at, especially when they do these kind of genres. Then the first question is a lot trickier, at least for Egil Saga, in the sense that there are scholars who argue that actually Egil Saga is modeled on some themes, on Arthurian themes, and so maybe there is here a direct influence. But other scholars are not so sure about this. There is a kind of big debate on how the kind of Icelandic saga, the kind of family sagas, as you know, tend to know them in English, are modeled on continental models or not. I'm more of a kind of a traditional, in the sense that I tend to see that Arthurian influence, at least for that saga, is minor. Other sagas are clearly Arthurian. Some are even direct translation of Arthurian material, so there is no question there. I'm not sure if in Egil Saga the topic is the kind of the motive is taken from the Arthurian literature. It might be not. I'm meet on the maybe not side, but it's clear that these kind of patterns were known at the time in Iceland, and it's most likely that in some sources they incorporate this matter. And yes, the possibility at least is certain that they're ripping off a thing that you see, or it's maybe kind of a similar ideology. That's another possible answer. Yeah, they think similarly.
Or it could be an analogous fear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Overexpansion. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so people, if you have any questions, you can just type it on the YouTube comment section, and you can type it in both English or Portuguese. Só lembrando a todos que, se vocês tiverem qualquer pergunta, vocês podem fazer aí no comentário do YouTube, e vocês podem fazer em português ou em inglês, a gente faz a tradução se for necessário. Então, façam a pergunta aí. E o formulário, pelo visto, provavelmente está sendo resolvido, então tem um pouquinho de paciência. Ok.
Questions? No questions.
Don't make us call on you.
Yeah, people are shy.
Or tired.
Yeah, that's also a possibility. That's also a very... Yeah, that's a very real possibility. Especially
it's almost the last day of this Congress, so...
Yeah, especially if they're following it since morning, like...
Yes, like
12
8.
Hours. Like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., so 12 hours. That's a lot.
That's something weird about you Brazilians. Yes. You make your conferences so long. It's like, Jesus, it's 8 p.m. I should be having dinner and getting drunk by now.
Yeah, we like big conferences here.
I know.
Well, you know, maybe Santiago, I mean, given the fact that this is recorded, Santiago, maybe we should type our emails into the chat.
Sure.
If that's
that could work, yeah.
And then anybody who wants to sort of follow up with a question later, when they're not so tired.
That's actually very
nice.
And
not so shy.
And
yeah.
Mine is there.
Okay, and then we can put those in the description of the video afterwards, so everyone can see it regardless of time of the video.
I would like to know more about the monsters.
Oh,
fair enough.
Monsters are wonderful. Oh, they are wonderful. Because you have to remember that.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, you have to remember that the interesting thing about it is that, you know, if you take a look, monster comes from it's kind of like it comes from two different roots, right? One is the Latin monere, meaning to warn, right? And the other one is like a show or demonstration, right? Meaning a wonder or so. So monstrosity is always kind of overdetermined. Like, how do you do it? So, for example, in a lot of the early, like, for example, some of the early historical chronicles, right, in England, monstrosity could be seen as a sign of, you know, a portent of something bad happening, but also not necessarily something good happening. So there was a monstrous birth in one of the Robert of Gloucester's chronicles, in which there was the kind of the entry for this chronicle for this particular year was that there was a woman who gave birth to a child with 4 arms and 2 legs, right? And in that year, there was great plenty of harvest, right? So the sort of excess of limbs here was actually a sign of sort of productivity and fertility, right? And, you know, and a good harvest, like an excess of things. But then on the other hand, there are also things in which there were monstrous births, right? That were signs of trouble or torment, right? Or political upheavals or something along those lines. So it was the kind of interpretation of it depended on the person. But the interesting thing, the way in which they're using monstrosity in a lot of these sort of texts justifying the conquest of Ireland is the same thing that you see in, is the same method that you see in the idea of creating a self or community versus the other, which is seen as monstrous. And unfortunately, we've seen that happening over and over again, even in recent political structures. You know, defining your other, you're defining those who are opposed to you as inhuman, right, less worthy, or even in some ways, right, the things that should be destroyed. I'm thinking, for example, about monstrous category confusion and the kind of excessive violence that is leveled against transgender people, right? Who are seen as violating what is seen as a primary gender binary that is, you know, that underpins so many, you know, so many other binaries and supports them. And so because they are seen as being uneasily along this binary, it's not just that they get killed in a way that evokes like the kind of overkill that you would do with monsters, right? Their faces are beaten in, or they're set on fire, or they're shot multiple times. And what you see is the fear and anxiety, really sort of existential attack on people's sense of who they are, that trans people have a tendency to sort of provoke in people who are very much invested in an idea of sort of natural sexes and distinctions in there. In the same way that even mild manifestations of that are, like, for example, I was looking at a YouTube about female bodybuilders, right? And the comments below it, and of course I made the mistake of reading the comments, right, which is always a mistake, right? But the comments below it were just horrifying, right? With people saying, oh my God, that's disgusting. And then people saying, oh my God, kill it with fire, right? Right? Okay. If somebody is not manifesting femininity in a way or including on that territory, even if they're not technically transgender, that it's automatically there's this visceral response of fear and disgust from people, right? And an immediate knee-jerk reaction to try to get rid of it. So yeah, in this case, right, the deliberate sort of constructing of the Irish as monstrous then becomes kind of like, for example, if you think about what happened in Nazi Germany with the dehumanization of the Jews as being these evil, child-killing, blood-drinking monsters. And of course, that goes back to the Middle Ages, or plague rats or something along those lines. This is the kind of thing that basically then allows you, because no moral human might want to kill another human, but there's no problem in killing something that is monstrous or killing something that is dehumanized, no more than you're swatting a mosquito would be. Right? That's a really long blathering answer, but
and if we bring this to the political spectrum, it's not unlike what the US and Brazil as well did on the 60s and forward with communism by creating this idea of, oh, these are not people, these are monsters. So they are an exception to the law. You can arrest them and you can take away their rights because they are communists.
Yeah, same as here, actually. In Argentina, we got that too.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you look at sort of early, if you look at sort of like Cold War comic books in the US, right? The communists basically, it's like Captain America versus the communists, and the communists literally have like these green faces, right, and like hyperextended fangs and that sort of thing. It's really amazing. We seem to have a question for
Santiago.
Yeah, so I will shift topic completely. It was very interesting talk on monsters. But okay, so Marcia asked me if I can talk a little bit more about my translation. Okay, I can. So it's not mine exactly. Actually, it's a translation I did with my students. Originally, the prose, we did it together. It was part of my regular courses on all laws. And so we sat down, learned the grammar, and then, you know, faced the real text, and we went through it. It took us 1.5 years because it's not a short saga, and we were like starting from scratch. And then what we did is I asked a specialist in poetry, Teodoro Manrique Antón, from the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. It's a major figure in honor studies in the Spanish-speaking world. And he translated the verses. And there is something interesting about this one, that he kept the verses in Iberian Spanish, while our prose is in a kind of Rioplatense, which is my native dialect. And now that this is interesting because sagas themselves have a shift in kind of, I won't say dialect, but in registry between that was fun, Lauryn, between the prose and the poetry. So the translation is available online, so you can download it for free, the PDF. It's also, the bad news about this translation is that Bjarnar Saga is not a particularly great saga. It's, you know, it's not horrible. It's not, you know, it's not the kind of first thing you want to read if you read saga. So go and read Egil Saga. But all the good ones have already been translated into Spanish, so I had to pick the leftovers. But it's there. I did before another one, Hensathori Saga, which I mentioned. So yes. So Lauryn made a comment in private here, which is funny. I should read it. It's like, can I just say how envious I am that you got to spend over a year geeking out and translation with students? Yes, that's the majesty of working in Argentina. You know, you don't get paid well, but you can do whatever you want. And this is a good thing. Mm. We don't get money, but we get time for doing whatever we want.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I won't complain. I'm fine with that.
Yes, I've been trying to. My dream is that basically at some point I will be able to do an entire semester on translating Beowulf from Old English, right? But I have a feeling I would get like basically one student who would run screaming in fear after that, and then they wouldn't allow me to do it anymore.
You know, I've seen that the other day. They published a kind of collective translation of Beowulf. It was done by a kind of ridiculous amount of people, and it turned out well. I saw kind of few friends of mine were inside, like, and so on. So why not start? Maybe not the easiest text to begin with. It's like, what are we going to tackle? Beowulf. Oh, Jesus Lord.
Is that the one they use Bro?
What? Sorry?
Is that the version they use Bro as a translation?
I do not know exactly because I quickly looked at it, so I'm not sure if that's the same one we are talking about.
I just got a bit on the news last year about a translation for Beowulf. There was
oh, I heard about that. I haven't seen it though.
A term, an Old Norse term as bro, basically, and I thought that was
the first
pretty interesting, to be honest. I don't know the exact details though, so I can feel you out on that.
Well, if you think about it, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the opening word of Beowulf, flat, right? Really, the best translation you can come up with for it is "yo," right? You know, yo, listen up. Yeah.
I have a problem when I translate from Old Norse. A lot of time, the best word I get in my head is absolutely vulgar slang words from Rio Platense. Sometimes it's like the perfect word here. I cannot publish it because it's absolutely out of place, but sometimes it fits so well because Icelandic, it's so vulgar. I cannot say this in public. Sorry. Okay, anyway.
Yeah,
let's move on to a different topic.
Okay, do we have more questions? People, don't be shy. No one's gonna bite. It's all virtual after all.
Oh. Oh, they are tired.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fair enough.
People seem to be wearing off already. But that's totally not your fault, though. Again, as Santiago pointed, long conferences in Brazil are pretty long. And this is like the third day, right?
Yeah, everybody's like...
So people are doing this for 3 days already.
3 days in a row, and then you start having like dark shades under your eyes, especially when you end up the conference, and then you go drinking, which is something you do there. We do.
Yeah, we usually do that on the last day.
We start earlier.
Yeah, that's the part we miss the most from the physical conference, I guess, because it's not the same to drink in front of a computer.
Hope next year we can do it the normal way again.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, that would be good. Yeah, it's terrible that I have to buy my own drinks here. I mean, you know, this is like...
Yeah, and
not share. You cannot.
Yeah, that's a bad part for me. Buying my own drink is not the problem. It's like I want to drink with somebody. It's like we are in this because we want to drink, not because we like books and that kind of stuff. Oh, sorry.
Well, but you know, see, that's why you have to have a pet, because if you have a pet, you're never drinking alone.
Oh, that's a good point.
That's a good point.
Lucas, go ahead.
Yeah.
Lucas again? Okay, here we go.
Lucas again.
Yeah,
He has a quick question. Lucas with a quick question.
But it's quick for him.
He's typing.
You were talking about next year, and although to a certain degree, I believe the remote thing is going to stay, and that's not necessarily bad, because look at this. We can connect people from 3 different countries with minimal cost. But yeah, we really need to go back to a little bit more physical as well.
A mixed pattern will be great.
Away from not being there when you can be there, which is not always the case.
Oh, it's a question for Lauryn. Is there a gender pattern in the monster construction?
Oh, good question. There is actually there's what I would call gender horror, right? That, for example, that first slide you with the sort of bearded lady, that's designed to inspire horror, right? And with gender horror, like with other forms of category confusion, right? One of the things you see is category confusion is an attack on your epistemological ability, right? In other words, like, let's say, for example, if you are trying to determine the essence of something from its appearance, from its accident, going back to Aristotle, right? You need to use the accident of something to determine what it is. Okay, so in other words, if you have something that has 2 different markers, right? It has the breasts of a woman, but has a beard, okay, which is a marker of a man, then what is it, right? It's both and yet neither. And in that sense, right, gender is used as a form of horror, right? The other one too, right, is of course Caxton talking about the fact that certain behaviors that were seen as naturalized gender, like men pissing standing up and women pissing sitting down, were reversed in Ireland, which is going back to that early modern idea of the world upside down, or the medieval idea of the world upside down and out of control, right? That's marked by gender. They're also, going back to your point, there are very specific sort of gendered monstrosities, right? Like these women who are turning into rabbits, okay? So that something is being evil, like women's inherent sort of evil, is masquerading as something innocent. And the rabbits are really interesting, because what the rabbits are is they're sort of conflating the idea of the witch and the witch's familiar. So the women turn into rabbits in order to sort of innocently hop into people's houses or hop into people's barns and steal the milk from the cows, or make people sick, into the grain and poison it, or something along those lines, right? So yeah, there is a definite, and this goes back to medieval, particularly clerical misogyny about how women are inherently sort of deceitful and evil and the repository of corruption. Thanks, that's a great question.
Is there other questions?
Come on, people, last chance. It's now or never.
Oh, it's never.
Yeah, yes, it's never. Or maybe next year.
Yes.
Next year. Okay, and like I said, we do have our emails in there. So if something springs to mind, by all means, go ahead and I'm cool with you emailing me. If there's anything else you want to talk about, I'm always happy to geek out on monstrosity in Ireland and medieval stuff, pamphlet culture stuff.
Okay.
So, Lauryn, Santiago, I would like to thank you again for the great night. Luis, I would like to thank you too.
So thank you.
Oh,
Dani,
yes, Luis,
Lauryn.
thank you, and Daniela, thank you very much. Yeah, Santiago, I'm so interested. I have actually an entire shelf full of Icelandic sagas that I've always been meaning to get to, and now I have another motivation to do it. So I will go back and do that, and maybe we can go back and geek out on those too.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
you
so
all.
much, everyone. I really enjoyed this. And I really hope that we can do more of this maybe in person next time. Okay, I must go take
I hope so.
Again, thank you so much. I really so.
Lauryn, your audio just had a slight issue, so if you could just
She's gone.
I think she disconnected.
She's gone.
Well, my time to do exactly the same. So, obrigado para todo mundo lá. Prazer ficar aqui falando com vocês e voltar para o português agora um pouquinho. Tá. Boa noite, você.
Boa noite.
Então, boa noite.
Muito obrigado.
Valeu, gente. Até uma próxima, né?
Muito obrigado a todos que ficaram aqui até o final.
Exatamente. Então é isso.
Tchau, tchau.
A gente encerra a mesa 3 assim, desejando uma boa noite e um bom final de evento amanhã para todo mundo.
Até mais.